This is CNN's Global Town Hall. We're going to get answers to more of your questions ahead. Good Friday, of course, is tomorrow. Easter Sunday is only a couple of days away.
And normally churches across the country would be packed, but not in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. So with us now is evangelical pastor Rick Warren.
Pastor Rick, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Hi, Anderson. Hi, Sanjay. Good to see you guys.
Let's begin with just kind of your thoughts of where we all are right now in this country's history and in this pandemic.
Well, I first heard about the COVID-19 pandemic in January because Saddleback has campuses, our church, actually in 4 continents. And Saddleback Hong Kong actually went to online services about 8 weeks ago. And we distributed about 150,000 masks in Hong Kong in January and February.
Wow.
So it was kind of like the canary in the mine that we heard early on that it was going to happen. And as the news and the panic about COVID-19 began to spread, I started getting calls, texts, emails, social media messages from pastors and priests all around the world asking the exact same question: is Easter going to be canceled this year? And my answer to the same was the same to all of them, and it was this: as shepherds, we are called to protect God's flock, not just feed it and lead it. And if you really love your congregation, tell them to stay at home on Easter. That's going to curtail assembling, but it's not going to curtail our celebration. Easter it'll be curtailed, but it won't be canceled. Because nothing can actually cancel the resurrection. It happened 2,000 years ago, split history into AD and BC, and every time we use a date, even our birthdays, we're using the resurrection as the focal point. I've tried to help these pastors around the world. We have quite a large network of about 1 million pastors. On Monday, I did a global pastors prayer gathering and with leaders from all the continents, and over 1 million pastors around the world tuned into that as we were preparing them for the first Easter in 2,000 years where Christians aren't actually meeting. But there's a lot of other ways. Easter will certainly be celebrated. And one of the things I reminded them is I said, you guys, we're not the first Christians to stay at home in fear on Resurrection Day, because that's actually what happened at the very first Easter. Peter and John and all those other guys who were the disciples had that same experience at the very first Easter. John chapter 20, verse 19 says, that night, talking about Easter night, the disciples were huddled in a home, locked, with the doors locked for fear of the authorities. Now, they weren't afraid of a virus, but they were afraid that the same group of people who had crucified Christ might come after them. And so, congratulations, you're celebrating the way the first Easter was celebrated, in a home with the door locked for fear. And the second thing I would tell them is there was no mega church at the first Easter. Jesus just showed up in their homes to everybody's surprise, and I have no doubt that he'll do that again in tens of millions of homes this Easter.
And Saturday was a day of silence as well.
That's exactly right.
I'm curious, in your world, Pastor, and in my world as a doctor, the human touch is so important, the laying on of hands in medicine. How are you going to observe? I know you're going to do this, via technology, but how important is it, the human touch, and how much is it going to impact your congregation?
Well, there's no doubt about it. Human touch is extremely important. In fact, everywhere Jesus went, he gave a look, a word, and a touch. A look, a word, and a touch. He would look people in the eye. He would give them, which said, you matter to me. He would give them a word of encouragement, and he would give them a touch, pat on the back, a hug, a squeeze. And doctor, that preemies that aren't touched get failure to thrive syndrome, that we are made to be touched. But right now, in our current restrictions on public gatherings and on the lack of touch that we have, we need to remember that Jesus never intended for his church to just be merely an event that people go to. It's a family that we're supposed to belong to. And God wanted a family. That's why he created the universe. And while worship is the first purpose of the church, it's not the only one. Jesus outlined 4 other purposes, including fellowship, creating authentic community, discipleship, helping people grow their souls, grow spiritually mature, mission, reconciling disconnected people to God, and ministry, serving the needs and hurts of everyone. And any church can keep doing those, even with social distancing. In the last 2.5 weeks, we have fed 30,000 households in 2.5 weeks, just our church alone. And so we have about 550 ministries in the community. You don't have to have a big assembly to keep doing. In fact, I train pastors, and I've had over 1 million pastors in 197 nations take purpose-driven training. We tell them, here's how you spell church, C-H-U-R-C-H. C, care and comfort the anxious. H, help and heal the hurting. U, uplift the tired and discouraged. C, care for people's souls and spiritual growth. And H, heal the sick. All of those can keep on being done. People don't realize that the church basically invented healthcare. We invented the hospital, not government, not business. The reason Christianity spread, if you know history, is because of 2 plagues in the Roman Empire, that when people began to flee the urban areas of the Roman Empire because of the plagues, in the 2nd century and in the 3rd, Christians moved in to take care of the sick. And they said, see how they love one another.
You talk about feeding. It is, at a time like this, you really see how churches, food banks, community organizations are filling that need for feeding people, literally feeding people. I also wanted to ask you, you and I were talking about this right before we came on air.
Sure.
My brother died by suicide. You lost a son to suicide. You know
Right.
what grief is like. There's a lot of folks who have lost loved ones and who are scared tonight of losing loved ones, or who have lost loved ones and may be watching. I'm just wondering, what do you say to people in that, in what is now the worst time in their life, in which the future seems so distant and it's hard to imagine ever even smiling again?
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me talk about that, because that's important. There's going to be a lot of grief. People are going to lose loved ones who died, but they're also going to lose jobs. There's the grief of not being able to go to graduation, the grief of not being able to watch a baby be born. People are losing out in all kinds of different ways right now. And so there's going to be this tsunami of grief behind, even after we pass the top of the curve and we start to flatten it and it lowers, that we've got to deal with the grief of lost opportunities and lost times of life. We're not very good at grieving, but grief is actually a good thing. Grief is the way we get through the transitions of life. There is no growth without change. There is no change without loss, and there's no loss without pain and without grief. There is no time limit. There is no shelf life on grief. Everybody grieves differently. And to force people, are you over it? If you lose a loved one, it's like losing part of your arm. The rest of your life, you're going to know it's not there. And people go, are you over it? No, you don't get over it. You get through it, but you don't get over it. And after my son died, Kay and I had no idea that we would end up spending the last 7 years helping a lot of well-known people in grief, because nobody knows how to deal with it. You don't suppress it. You don't repress it. You confess it to God and you express it. Feelings are meant to be felt. The only reason we have feelings is because we're made in the image of God. God is an emotional God. The Bible says God gets angry. The Bible says God gets sad. The Bible says God gets jealous. The Bible says God gets impatient. The Bible says God gets frustrated. We're made in his image. So feelings are simply meant to be felt. And if you stuff them, it's kind of like shaking up a can of Coke and putting it in your refrigerator. It's one day going to explode and come out sideways. And so we're going to have a lot of grief counselors helping people after the threat of the virus subsides with the next wave of the emotional fallout. I'm trying to deal with all of this is Saddleback's 34th national or international disaster. that we've been in the 40 years I've been a pastor. This is the 40th. Poignantly, this Easter would have been Saddleback's 40th birthday. Kay and I started this church 40 years ago with just the two of us. Now there's 180,000 names on the roll, and we're on 4 continents. But it just happened. And so what we have to do is we have to teach people how to deal with grief.
Let me ask you a question I think comes up from a lot of people. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's felt existential to some people, an existential threat. This is a question that was submitted over Instagram that says this, Pastor Warren, I'd like to know, where's God in a pandemic? Why does God allow such a harmful thing to happen?
Sure. Very good questions, and there are actually two. The first one is, where is God in a crisis? The answer is, he's in the hearts of his people. All those people you see out there helping others, that's God in the hearts of those people. I don't know why, but in a situation, as I said, I've been through now 34 of these national pandemics or international crises. Dr. Bob Redfield, we've traveled together around the world in different pandemics, including the AIDS pandemic, which Saddleback has been very involved in for decades. Some people turn to God, some people turn away from God. It just reveals what's inside of us. But there's two questions. The first question is, where's God? People said, where was God when my son died? He's the same place he was when his son died, on the cross. He was grieving the inhumanity of humanity to each other. He was grieving. God, the Bible says God weeps. But you also see God in the goodness of people. When Katrina hit, I took 4,000 volunteers to New Orleans. And we worked there for 3 or 4 years. Our church paid the salaries of 400 small African-American churches where they totally lost their buildings. Where was God? It was in the hearts and generosity of our people. The other question, though, is, why does God allow this? When people ask, why does God allow something go wrong in the world, what they're expecting is heaven on earth. This is not heaven. This is earth. In heaven, everything's done perfectly. There is no sadness, no sorrow, no sickness, no stress. None of that's true here on earth. That's why we're to pray in the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Because on earth, it's rarely done. In heaven, it's done perfectly, completely, and all the time. And so we shouldn't expect heaven on earth. God could get rid of all the evil in the world real simple. Take away our choice. Because when I do evil, God, our greatest gift is our freedom of choice. It's also our greatest curse, because I don't always choose the right thing, and I hurt people, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Pastor Rick Warren, it's always good to talk to you. It's really good. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight.
Thank you.
I wish you the well and peace in the days ahead. Up next, something to cheer your spirit, a message of hope ahead.